Hello and welcome to the World Economic Forum here in Davos. Welcome also to the launch of PwC's 27th annual Global CEO Survey, and a huge apology that we're running late. For those of you who've made it through the weather and the security issues, a big thank you. You'll understand why. We appreciate your patience. And for those of you who are joining us online, thank you so much for waiting. We've had a few logistical issues, let's say, in getting the room together, and indeed in getting the PwC Global Chair Bob Moritz through the queues and in the room. He'll be joining us in a minute. Meantime, let me introduce myself. My name is Nisha Pillay, and it's a pleasure to be with you here today. So, Bob and I are going to be sharing with you the highlights of this year's survey, of course. And then Bob will be very happy to take your questions from people here in the room with us, and also from those joining us remotely on the live stream. So we're gathered here in Davos at a time not just of logistical challenges, but challenges on a much greater scale and huge, huge change. Global temperatures, as we all know, are still very much on the rise. And as for the new kid on the block, AI, well, generative AI has the potential to overhaul whole industries. It's also top of mind for CEOs for a very good reason, because they're under immense pressure to rework, to reinvent their very business models in order to survive and to thrive. Now, some of you may recall that one of the highlights of last year's survey was that a very large number of CEOs, almost 40%, were worried that their business models were not viable or were not likely to be viable across the next 10 years. Has anything changed? Are they more optimistic? Let's find out from Bob. A big warm welcome to Bob Moritz. So, anything change? Are CEOs more confident? Are they feeling their business models are more robust now, 2024?
First off, Nisha, thank you, and a pleasure to be with you again this year. And to the audience, again, my apologies for the timing issue that we had here. And for those online, very much so. Thank you very much for your patience and sticking with us. As you think about the confidence level that the CEOs have on that disruption point that you raised, Nisha, the reality is it is not only continued to be troubling for them, but is actually increased in terms of the number of CEOs that see that disruption risk and question whether they've got the ability to change sufficiently fast enough, broad enough, big enough to actually overcome these external events. And we see on the chart in front of you that number going from the 39% that we had last year to 45%. So let's dive deeper into that really quickly. First, you see much more concern at the smaller to medium-sized enterprises than the larger enterprises. Number two, you see different levels of concern around the world. So depending on what region you may be in, we'll talk about that later, probably in the Q&A section. And you do see an element of differentiation, but not as much by the sector cut that we provide. Because the reality is every CEO, no matter what sector you may be in, is dealing with this challenge right now. When you look at the external forces of change, their ability and confidence to actually change their organizations to adapt, and last but not least, have a business model that is sustainable for the foreseeable future.
And are they worried about the global economy, the immediate economic outlook?
For sure. This is the dilemma that CEOs have to deal with. It's the immediate economic outlook in the short term versus then this long-term disruption issue. So as you look at the survey, what a lot of people focus on is what's the views of the CEOs relevant to the economy, relevant to their own local GDP opportunities, and relevant to their own personal opportunities to grow revenue from a CEO perspective relevant to their own organizations. Now, last year, we actually had a record high level of pessimism. This year, you have a little bit more optimism and a lot less pessimism. Now, let's talk about that for a second, because the reality is this is a relative comparison to the last year. And where we were last year, as you recall, as we went through the conversations, we had tremendous uncertainty with supply chains, tremendous uncertainty with inflation, tremendous uncertainty with interest rate risks and other elements like that. And while those are still big risks and concerns, there is a little bit more stability and understanding of the trajectory of what's happening in those areas in particular that allow the CEOs to be less uncertain about the views of a global economy, allow them to think about what it means for their local countries in terms of where those local economies are going, and last but not least, be in a position to say with confidence, what else can I do and can I raise the revenues? What's really interesting is their confidence is not as high on their ability to raise revenues locally themselves, where you had the reverse last year when we were together. Why is that? We all acknowledge there's a slowing economy because of those conditions I mentioned.
Very nuanced response of yours there, Bob. Any other near-term threats that CEOs are worried about that they feel will undermine their viability?
Sure, there's a number of different things as you look at this particular slide that bring those issues to the table. Inflation, like I said, still a risk, but not as big of a risk when you look at the totality from last year, hence the change that you see on the slide here. But nonetheless, still the number one risk on a worldwide basis. Macroeconomic volatility comes again from those combination of factors which lead you to the concerns about a slowing economy more broadly. The one area where we are increasing the amount of risk that CEOs see is this issue around cyber, which we'll come to in a couple of minutes, which all ties to the AI agenda and the digitization agenda. And maybe just to correct one thing, Nisha, we've got to be really clear when we get to the AI conversation. AI is not the new kid on the block. AI has actually been around a very long time. What's new is the generative AI component piece of that and the human touch and the interaction that it has. And that has got tremendous opportunities going forward. The last thing I will say here is we do see a lot of different degrees of where the top risks reside, depending on what country or what region you may be in. In the Americas, particularly North America, it's still inflation. When you look at some other countries around the world, particularly Europe, regulatory risk still remains extremely high. And you also get a little bit of cyber risk in the regulatory regimes coming from what's happening, of course, Europe as well. So each one's a slightly nuanced variance in terms of what the CEO community is ultimately worrying about these days that they see as risks they need to manage. One last point on this risk piece. We are starting to see differentiation amongst the CEOs that think they can manage the risks versus the risks that are outside of their control. In that case, they're scenario planning more than anything else rather than doing something about it directly when they come up.
Okay, so let's just step back from this for a moment, Bob. What do you see as the key drivers behind the urgency that CEOs feel to reinvent their businesses?
The real big one, as you see on this next slide, is going to be technology and, as you said, the implications and opportunities and risks that arise from technology and AI specifically. As I said, let's break that down for a moment. Augmented AI, where you use technology, bringing together massive amounts of data to actually give people better information and make better decisions, is what we call augmented AI. That doesn't replace humans. It makes them better workers, more productive, more effective, more efficient. That's been around a really long time. The big risk that CEOs see now is this autonomous AI, this next generation generative AI, is going to actually then do things much differently and have the potential to replace work or maybe even workers. And that's the transformation piece that becomes really important. And what you have to think about in technology is not the technology itself, but the downstream implications to it. What do I mean by that, Nisha? The reality is consumption will be different. Consumer behavior will be different. Your engagement with your employees will be different. Let's just think about that for a second. If you're going to recruit the best talent in the world, they're going to want to know you give them access to AI to learn, to adjust, to co-create. If you're not, you're at a competitive disadvantage. You've got to pay more now to recruit those people in. So you now have a business model issue if you're not keeping pace with the changes that consumers expect, employees expect, and your stakeholders expect.
So tell us a bit more of what you see as the impact of generative AI. What do CEOs think it's likely to do to their businesses?
Yeah, so again, if you go to the feedback we got from that CEO community, you see CEOs, and particularly around the top part of the agenda, in the last 12 months, Jay has already been adopting and being adopted within their organizations. In some cases in scale, in some cases relatively minor as they test. And I do think organizations have to think carefully about the risk and the rewards, the cost and the value proposition that they bring to the table as to whether they really can capture that. Because we want to be clear, there is a cost to this. It's not free. And they do have to think about the ROI that comes from that, the energy consumption that comes from using it, et cetera. What is most interesting is at the bottom part of the page. And this is where we see CEOs really recognizing that their organizations are going to fundamentally be changed by AI. It's going to create new products. It's going to change the products and services that they have today. It's going to change their interface with those consumers. It's going to change the price point of those product offerings. So how you create, capture, and take advantage of the value that's going to be created, every CEO around the world just about is seeing the upside potential for that. And last but not least, it does require then a different set of skills in the organization to drive the cultural change, upskill the people to use it effectively and efficiently, and they themselves as CEOs be more aware of what's the world of possibilities, because they're limited by what they know today, not by what's going on around them. And there's a lot out there that we see that's going on around them.
And how cognizant are CEOs of the risks of generative AI, the unintended consequences, if you like?
Yeah, so the big one, as I hinted towards before, is as you look to first the digitization agenda, and we saw a huge change in the COVID world where CEOs, management teams, consumers had to use technology much more so, you ended up with a much more interconnected world. The second thing then comes from this focus point of, if I've got a much more interconnected world, I've got much more data, and I'm interacting with a lot more technology. Sometimes I control them myself, sometimes they're third parties or other parties that actually have those technologies. That means there's more likelihood for cyber risks and concerns about that. So as you see in this chart, cyber risk has always been a big risk. When we ask CEOs what's most important, it's always been in that top 5 or 10, no matter what country we may be in. But today, this risk has really risen. And you see this particularly in Europe. You see it a little bit less so, nonetheless still important in Asia. And it is the combination of the digitization efforts now coupled with a whole new speed of change from generative AI that causes those CEOs to be concerned about it. The second piece I want to hit on, and it ties to the previous slide, this concern about spread of misinformation. So CEOs today, their C-suites, their supervisory boards, in general, would say we have a trust deficit. One of the things that's a theme here at Davos is, in fact, regaining trust, rebuilding trust. So can technology actually bring that more positively to bear? Now, what's interesting is here you see the statistic that says they're worried about the risk where these technologies may spread misinformation. If you looked carefully at the previous slide, you saw the CEOs that had a little bit more foresight saying AI would actually help them enhance trust. So we probably have a bit of a timing issue here in terms of will the AI be useful in the trust game or will it be negative? And it all comes back to how do they manage that? What do I mean by...
Yes, they seem sort of contradictory.
They're contradictory, and it comes back to this point issue of how they manage it. So if you're talking to your consumers or you're making commitments on climate, for example, the AI could help you report better, could help you achieve faster the commitments that you committed to, and thereby, when you engage with your stakeholders, enable more trust. But if used in the wrong way, and you have misinformation coming from it, then that's an element of where trust is going to be broken, both from your consumer, your employees, as well as the larger stakeholder community.
I'm glad you mentioned climate, Bob, because we can't just talk about generative AI all evening. And it's another big driver of reinvention, isn't it? What actions are CEOs taking to implement their climate strategies?
Yeah, the CEO survey clearly brings this across as well. We touched on this last year for those that are with us. You have a significant opportunity where CEOs are trying to bring into their product offering, their service offering, et cetera, the concept of climate and less emissions, but also less energy being used. And let's go back to what was really important in the COP meetings that we just went through in the Middle East, where they were hosted. The commitments that came out of that were, let's focus on reducing emissions. Let's make sure we enhance renewables, but also for the first time ever, let's actually attack the issue of consumption, consumer demand in the space of energy. So you see many organizations taking actions on energy efficiency. We will argue later this week that the actions are big in terms of the 76% that say they're doing it, but there's so much more opportunity that is out there, because many are pulling small levers of change, not big levers of change, or many different levers of change in mass to actually go after that energy transition. I'll give you a very simple and relative example just for us sitting in the room right now. This hotel probably has the temperature set for the air conditioning and the heating at a certain level. The lights automatically are creating a tremendous amount of heat. We probably could turn the temperature down and save a lot of energy in this room, just in this meeting alone. Will humans be thoughtful enough to do that? Or when you combine the two, will the AI do that for us automatically? And that's where the opportunities from climate come, when you can bring climate and AI together. The other thing that's really interesting in the climate space, we don't see as many organizations factoring in climate into their financial planning short-term and long-term. It's a cost today. That's a problem. And second, they are not as focused on the physical risk implications. If you pause and step back, the middle part of planet Earth is ripe with opportunities for drought or significant flooding from catastrophic weather events. Well, many organizations have physical plants in those areas, call centers in those other areas, et cetera. And if we haven't thought about those kind of risks, then you again are in a recipe for disaster should anything happen to your organization. So those are a couple of things that organizations are trying to pay attention to now.
Yeah, and CEOs are very well aware that they need to pay attention to those things coming down the highway at them. But what have they already done to rethink and adapt their business models?
Well, it's clear that the CEO community has tried to think about how can I adopt new technologies to change the business offerings I have today. On the other end of the spectrum, how can I bring in and buy new technologies and maybe even do some M&A that actually allows for me to bring some new IP and some new talent into my organizations. And one of the emerging trends we're starting to see is the opening up from that M&A perspective. The deal market's been pretty quiet recently. We're starting to see the opening up in terms of analysis and eventual capital deployment. The second thing, though, is how they rethink consumption and consumer demand. And they are much more attuned to what the consumers want, but also how they will purchase it. And they will do that with thinking about the top two topics, that being climate and AI. They'll think about, how do I mass market electronically versus physically going to stores? The AI will help them rethink that and attack that on a very targeted basis. Likewise, if certain consumers are willing to actually engage on consumption with climate in mind, they will have that knowledge with the data that exists to target them very specifically and redesign a product, an offering, in new and different ways. So we see the CEOs driving change. What's really interesting is, again, you see larger organizations making these changes. You see the smaller ones falling a little bit behind, but you definitely see this particularly within certain sectors around the world. Healthcare, technology, media, et cetera, definitely are on the high front of this one. As you look at construction, it's not in the obvious space, but it is there. When you look about the AI that's being brought into the construction area as a sector more broadly, because they're actually trying to react to the climate risks. And then when you look at consumer organizations, they're doing it relevant to consumer. They're not doing a lot of it relevant to their own operations. So there's some opportunities, I think, that exist in certain sectors as well.
So we've been talking a lot about reinvention with a capital R, the opportunities and the challenges. But what about some of the age-old issues that businesses face, the internal challenges, which can be so sticky and hard to overcome, right? How can CEOs begin to tackle those?
So last year when we left you, we talked about the concern about reinvention. And what we try to do this year is talk a little bit more about the what does it mean and what our organization is doing about it, but also what's getting in the way. And what this particular set of data points is showing you is that what's getting in the way is mostly controllable. So if you look at the top 5 items on the page, the first one is regulatory environment. CEOs cannot control that. You can try to figure out a way to, as best you can, manage for those regulatory requirements on a worldwide basis. And because of the combination of the world we live in, when you think about elements of consumption, when you think about competing regulators around the world, the regulatory environment continues to increase. Those that are managing this really well can't change the regulations. You still have to comply. Regulators are undefeated, folks. What you can do is actually bring large scales amounts of data together more effectively and efficiently to report, to comply, to deal with your compliance requirements. So they're taking actions on the external factor, but can't control the external factor. The other 4 on the page, though, are all items that they themselves can control. How many meetings do I have? How many emails do I put into the organization? How much clutter ends up in the organization that creates more bureaucracy, more inefficiency, and can only waste time? And this is the challenge right now, because the organizations that are driving that transformation change in scale with speed have really started to change culture. You can't get the opportunity and the upside without changing culture of an organization to be more fit for purpose looking ahead. And that's got to start with the top. So how that CEO, how she or he actually interacts with her or his leadership team is super important to set the stage for everything else.
And what does that mean exactly? From this, what can they do? What is the personal role of the CEO in driving this process?
Clarity and focus on what's most important, get everything else out of the way. Clarity in terms of how you run your meetings, make sure they're most effective and efficient. We don't need to bring people together for large amounts of time to re-deliberate old decisions, which also goes to the last point, which is hold people accountable for the decisions they made, rather than create the culture or environment where you may open up the door for re-deliberation, which just slows things down. And to that point, Nisha, I'll give you an example. One particular client that will stay nameless is that organization has, in the CEO's eyes, 5 strategic initiatives that they really are trying to pay attention to. The problem is his leadership team, in this case, is not aligned. Some want to do 2, some want to do all 5. No one's got consensus in terms of how to do it and over what time horizon. And sequencing these changes, either simultaneously, in parallel, or in some kind of other sequence, has got to be landed on by the leadership team. And that's the CEO's responsibility to drive that kind of agenda.
Thank you. Well, those are some of the highlights of this year's Global CEO Survey. Do you have any questions? This is your opportunity. If you put your hand up, we'll get a mic over to you. There's a question here in the 3rd row, lady in the far end. Please do tell us who you are. You might want to stand up.
Should I stand up? Okay. I'm Madoka Kitamatsu from Nikkei. It was quite interesting how the CEOs are less worried about geopolitical risks. So is this because they just got used to it, and they have not really any options to do about it? Or is this because they're well prepared? What do you think?
Yeah, if I can take a shot at that. I think you've got the geopolitical risk well advertised. We've been talking about it intensely for the last 2 years. When you look at, and maybe even beyond that, when you look at the different geopolitical issues that have arisen. So you do have an element of bigger awareness. You do have, I think, an element of how controllable is it and how big could it get. And you do have an element of a degree of muscle enhancement in organizations that now, rather than overreact and continue to talk about all the what-if scenarios, are now very much scenario planning. If this happens, this is what I'm going to do to minimize this risk or capture the opportunity. If that happens, I'll change my business model. Maybe I go elsewhere as I think about my supply chain. So think about where we were a year ago, where you had a number of different risks, some still lingering from COVID, that actually created significant concern about supply chains. What's happened since then is people have gotten a better handle on both their existing supply chains and the optionality around them. And what they've done over the last 12 months is spend some time developing new and different supply chains for alternative opportunities so that those scenarios play out. So I think there is a degree of better awareness, more resiliency to it, and a little less ownership of what truly can be contained, owned, and managed effectively. Thank you for the question.
Another question from the floor? And we'll come to you in a minute, if you don't mind, actually, because I've just seen that we've got one that's come in online from Andy in Colorado. Thank you, Andy. The question says, you've talked about the urgency CEOs feel to reinvent their business models, but what are the benefits of reinvention?
I'm going to start to engage with my leadership team here, if you don't mind. Carol Stubbings actually is the person responsible for our client activity. This is our markets programs, our line of service business, et cetera. Carol, maybe some perspective for you in terms of the benefits of driving this reinvention.
Yeah, so there's significantly a number of benefits for organizations. What we've seen is those organizations that have really focused on doing things that will make a difference to their organization, but also that they can control, have actually added between 3 and 5 basis points to their profitability. So the organizations that have really started to reinvent themselves, and by that, they've redeployed capital, they're relentlessly focused on execution, they've made sure that they've embraced technology, they've engaged with their workforce in terms of upskilling and reskilling, and actually they've dealt with some of these administrative tasks. You know, the CEO survey talks about 40% inefficiency on emails, meetings, hiring, recruitment, promotions. Those are things that don't need generative AI to deal with. Those are things that organizations just need to fix and fix quickly.
And are they fixable?
Oh, they are absolutely fixable. But again, it's tone from the top. Again, it's holding people to account. And again, it's really empowering the workforce to do things very differently.
Thank you, Carol.
Thanks, Carol.
Question over there, towards the back over there. Please tell us who you are.
Thank you. I'm Spriya from Business Insider. So CEOs have had a tough few years, from COVID to geopolitical crisis, lots going on, generative AI now, constantly having to innovate. But 2024 is also a tricky year. It's a year of elections. It could impact where these companies operate. What is the CEO community, what do they feel about it? How are they kind of positioning themselves?
Yeah, it's a great question. Here's what I would say about the world that we live in today and the amount of elections that are ongoing around the world. And we do know today there's probably 2 billion plus people that will be part of an election process somewhere around the world in the major countries. So what the CEO community is talking about is, I'm scenario planning for how that election may come out in terms of which political party may take control, et cetera. But it's scenario planning, because I can't control that, right? We've got millions and billions of people that will be part of this election, and they will be the ones to determine that. Second thing they're doing is make sure we're really clear on where the change driven by politics is coming from. And let me just give you a real-life example. In the States, what we found in the last couple of years was the fact that the federal government was generally a little less effective, some would argue ineffective, of driving the changes. What became more important was the business community rising up and the state governments actually taking actions before Fed or before waiting for any kind of federal guidance. So understanding where that's coming from is good and bad. And what I mean by that is now you have, and we see it in the US with California as example, coming up with their own rules on climate change. So organizations are trying to think that through. The other thing that is not getting talked about a lot is what's going to happen leading up to an election. And a lot more stress in the system about that. So what the CEOs are talking about today is they're asking their human capital function, their governance and regulatory affairs groups to scenario, what happens if we have disruption along the way? What if we have social unrest along the way? And how are we preparing for that potential risk as well? So it's not only the end result, it's the journey to get the result that organizations are now starting to talk about.
And here's a question that's come in online for you, Bob, from Laura in Birmingham. I don't know which Birmingham it is. It's Birmingham, UK, I think. Do you have any data on generative AI adoption in the UK? Are there any details you could share with us about who is adopting and why?
Yeah, and again, what I'm going to do is bring up my leadership team. Kevin Ellis is responsible for our UK operations, but also runs the EMEA region. He's been a member of our global leadership team for the last 8 years. So Kevin, some reactions from you.
Yeah, thanks, Bob. So what's interesting in the survey is that the UK CEOs, 42% of them say they are using generative AI compared to an average across the globe in the survey of 32%. Put that in context, there's only 3 countries in the world that have actually got a higher number than that, that being Japan, Norway and Finland. So that's the first factor. I think one of the reasons for that, if you look at the mix of the UK economy, it's very much a service-led economy. And therefore in the service sector, you've got to be part of the change, as Bob said earlier, both to employ and be a magnet for talent into your organization because everyone wants to be part of the Gen AI upskilling. And secondly, clients expect you to be part of the change and you do have to be a first mover. So I think that's what's driving, if you like, the UK CEOs are down that road. And I think that's probably why there is such a big impact there. The second factor, I think, is the perennial challenge of productivity. The UK still has a very tight labor market, and therefore maybe the secret source of productivity could come from Gen AI in terms of removing some of the, if you like, analyst skills and finding skills, and effectively therefore making the UK more productive. That's the kind of the optimistic lens on that one.
Thanks, Kev.
That's very interesting. Thank you. Who'd like to have the next question? We'll bring the mic over to you right away. Here, in the second row. Please tell us who you are, sir.
Hello, John Paul Ford-Rojas from the Daily Mail UK. What are CEOs telling you about the risks of operating in China? Because there's been lots of reports about firms, including some of your rivals, having, when they operate in Hong Kong and China, having to use burner phones, not use proprietary computers, and also consulting firms being raided by the Chinese authorities. So can you tell us about how that's affecting CEOs that you talk to?
So let me start with some broad comments first, and I'll ask Raymond Chow, our Asia Pacific leader, to come in on this one. You can talk about China, but you also actually talk about the broader global economy and all the different rules and regulations that exist. And why do I go broad first? Because China is just one small example. If you look at European privacy law, for example, organizations have to now comply with more rules and regulations for more different sources. So what does that mean? It means they will have to be having a more, I'll call it, fragmented approach to technology management and data management. You're going to have to comply with many different rules and regulations from different parts of the world. So there is an increasing cost, and there is an increasing complexity to that. And this is where, again, organizations that'll be on the forefront of that transformation, they'll know when to make those changes, how to make those changes fast, and do it ahead of their competitors in a more cost-effective and efficient way. So yes, there are challenges not only in China, but also around the world in terms of what the local, as I said earlier, states may be putting in, federal governments may be putting in, regions may be putting in. And we're starting to see that with not only data and technology, you're seeing it with climate, you're seeing it with AI. In fact, I'm going to say, from my perspective, Europe probably is the fastest new changer of AI regulation that's going to require something new and different than ever before. And organizations that are in that space are going to have to comply with that. Likewise, they already did that with climate. And organizations have to comply with that not only in Europe, but also across the rest of the world, depending on what size of operations you're coming out of Europe. So the amount of complexity, and that's why regulatory risk was really high, technology regulatory risk is just one of the elements there to be thinking about. Raymond, anything else you wanted to add?
Yeah, thanks, Bob. Hey, I think you've explained it very well. Well, first of all, I think we all need to understand China continues to open up. The policy is very clear. I mean, you've heard it from President Xi, and I think you're going to be hearing it over the next few days as well. So that is very clear. And as Bob said, this is not about a China issue. As AI, as technology continue to advance, how we manage data, store data, use data is going to be very important. We every day help our clients in terms of understanding how to use your data, how do you maximize and get the returns from using that data. Now, in China, obviously, and like other places, you have that in Europe, you have that elsewhere as well. There's data privacy laws, and there is data security laws. And you need to comply with those. And we work with clients every day in terms of helping them to comply with the complexities of navigating the different requirements and regulations around the world. And you will see examples where companies do not comply and therefore they get a penalty. And navigating in a very complicated world that we're in today, we need to work together. You need organizations working in multi-jurisdictions would need help and support from the likes of PwC to help them navigate through the different parts of the world.
Raymond, can I just sneak in a question there? Sorry, I'm abusing my privilege. I remember last year, CEOs in China were particularly worried about this reinvention risk, right? Has that changed at all? Could you answer that quickly?
Sorry, your question is?
Last year, Chinese were particularly worried about the viability of their business models. Has that changed at all?
No. And I think, and you've got to understand again, China has been going through reinvention in relation to the fact that China is moving from where it was before. That has become a miracle, obviously, in terms of growth and everything else, to what we're calling quality growth. So companies, organizations have been going through and are adjusting themselves or reinventing themselves for that quality growth. So logically, they are continuing to be very focused and view reinvention or transformation a very important part of their agenda. So I think the survey results reflect that the China CEOs are continuing to transform or reinvent themselves and their business models as they move forward to align with or to deal with some of the challenges that we just talked about, whether it's climate issues, whether it's AI, technology, plus the fact that they're transforming into a new economy.
Okay, great. Thank you very much, Raymond.
Thank you.
If I can build on two things. Thank you, Raymond. To come back to your very specific question on China for one more moment, what organizations are doing probably differently than they did before is just think about how they segment China. I will have China operations for benefit of China consumers. I will have China operations for enhancement of a supply chain for the rest of the world. And I'll have operations around the rest of the world that will provide goods and services to China. And each one of them is creating opportunities as you look at the economic changes that are happening. As Raymond said, you've got now policies and procedures to enhance that growth and move to quality growth. But you still have, I'm going to argue, the central and western part of the country still looking for more upside potential as you look at the rise of the middle class there. So back to your questions, many organizations still see the opportunities. It's just a question of now which ones do you want to go after very specifically.
Okay, here's another one online for you. Anish in Hamburg. Are there any particular focus areas or concerns that are top of mind for CEOs in Europe?
Yeah, so if I can, I'll bring Petra up. Petra was with us last year as well. She runs our PwC Europe operations and has the specific responsibilities from Germany. But Petra, maybe some particular angles that came out of the data points from the CEO survey there.
Yes, happy to do so. So let me focus on two topics. First one is AI as well. So if we look at the survey and look at what CEOs in Western Europe countries are saying concerning AI, it is that 27% recognize the strategic importance of AI, and almost 1/3 of them states that they have changed their technology agenda concerning AI. So AI has already led to a change of the technology strategic agenda of the companies. The second point I want to make is if we are looking to cyber risks, and Bob mentioned it earlier, so cyber is the top-notch risk we're seeing as a response of the CEOs in their near-term threats of the next 12 months. And there is a connection to AI. So if we ask for the reason, 70% of the CEOs say that AI will lead to an increase of cyber risks. And if you look at the territories within Western Europe, Germany and France, they are seeing that risk as their top risk. So the third point I want to make is the need for change. So we are in line with the global CEOs in Western Europe saying that there is a need for change and that business models won't be viable if there is no change within the next 10 years. So there is an economic challenge about that one. And looking at Europe, there is a big need for coordinated actions European CEOs need to take to increase attractiveness of Europe again, targeted investing in A, business model reinvention, B, climate issues, but also in trusted technologies. So again, AI at that point, so there is a big lever, big leverage in there, and that's what we're seeing in the responses.
Thank you very much, Petra. I think we've just got time for one more question. Who's the lucky person? Priya, you've asked one already. How about this? Please tell us who you are.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Matt Taylor, Kite Insights, and thank you for the last question. So I wanted to bring up sustainability. Our own research shows that really 2023 was the year for pressure on sustainability teams and CSOs to demonstrate commercial return, commercial viability. And when I say sustainability, I mean more than just climate, more than just energy, biodiversity loss, gender empowerment, and their interconnectivity. one of the solutions around that is often to align the sustainability strategy with the commercial business model, the core business. But from hearing your insights, to what extent do you think CEOs actually believe that in fact it's their core business model that needs to align with a sustainable economy? And what are the implications for them and their businesses, if so?
Why don't I tag team this one if I can, so it is the last question. I want to bring up Mohammed Kande. Mohammed actually has the responsibility of running our global advisory business, but he also is going to be my successor because I'm timed out, and he'll actually take over my responsibilities effective July 1st. That'll be a good chance for him to get up on stage to respond to the question, and then I'll also follow up with a couple of other insights on that one. So Mohammed, over to you.
So what was the question again?
Come on up, Mohammed.
So one of the things that we're finding out, Bob showed on the slide before that progress when it comes to climate action has been quite modest, except in the area of decarbonization, right? It's very clear that for many of the organizations that we work with, it's not just understanding what they have to do, but the magnitude of the action they have to take. And personally, this is where we see the intersection between the conversations we have had with GenAI, but also about climate. Problems cannot be solved, especially when it comes to climate action, if we not only understand what the problem is, but the magnitude of the problem that we're trying to solve. And this is where you see the intersection between GenAI and climate transition or climate change, because it's very data intensive, and GenAI can help solve that problem. Now, we all know that GenAI also consumes a lot of energy. There's no such thing as GenAI without computing power. There's no computing power without energy. So what we're now seeing in the world is that there are massive investments that are currently being made in the acceleration of investments into renewable energy. So we believe that GenAI can be a large consumer of energy, but also a catalyst for innovation in the energy field for more sustainable energy in the future. So when we work with many companies today to figure out what to do, it is still important for them when it comes to CSRD, ESG commitment, etc. The answer is yes. It's still important to them. The question is how big it is and what do they need to do. GenAI actually a very big thing when we think about the lever that can be pulled to try to understand the problems to be solved and how to solve these problems. So I hope that helps.
Thank you, Mohammed. If I can, maybe two other data points for you. The way we describe the two major drivers this year of AI and climate should not infer that they're bolted on to CEOs' strategies. They, in fact, what we're seeing is much more embedded in the strategy, and the sustainability elements now are becoming more front and center. And that's coming out for probably two major reasons. One, your stakeholder community is starting to demand more of it. And as a result of the stakeholder community demanding more of it, you are getting regulatory pressure from politicians to then react to that consumer, that citizen, whatever the case may be. Second thing you're getting is supervisory boards, to the extent they are existing in these organizations, public company or private companies, much more attuned to those opportunities and challenges. And I say that purposely because up until a couple of years ago, I think everybody saw it more as downside risk than upside potential. So when they're landing their strategies now, as Mohammed said, the revenue opportunity, the opportunity to price point and change price points for premium offerings that embed a better sustainable product offering there is coming to life. The way the human capital function pays attention to what's it going to take to attract the right talent and retain that talent if we're not thinking about these sustainability points. Let's be honest, the talent in the organizations are becoming the activists as well. So those pressure points are forcing the embedding of all of this in the strategies that the organizations have. Now, I want to be really clear. We still see examples where there's a strategy and then there's a bolt-on over here. And we still have examples of that, but we're starting to see a heck of a lot more convergence, I think, into what you actually ultimately talked about.
So I'm going to try and sneak in a last personal question, if I may, Bob. It's probably my last chance to do so in this context. If you look back on your many years leading PwC, and God knows how many countless conversations with CEOs, what advice would you give them today as you reflect on this kind of point of inflection that we're at?
let me hit a couple of different points, but I think there's a point that I want to take looking forward, not looking backwards.
Okay,
if I
go
can.
for it.
What we have seen and what I've experienced is the quality of the leadership team at the senior level and the middle management level is really going to be the differentiation looking ahead. And why do I say that? We've grown up with leaders that in the last probably 15 years now knew nothing but low interest rates coming out of the 2008 crisis. In fact, in some countries, we had negative interest rates. Many of these individuals don't know how to manage through a high rate or a higher rate interest rate environment. Likewise, volatility of energy pricing. We've seen that particularly over the last 2 years now when you look at the wars and others like that, and there was a degree of stability in that regard. So again, how do they know how to manage? So I come to this point of, and Mohammed and I were talking about it earlier today, we're going to have leadership teams challenged in a period of scarcity and a curve of growth that's more like this rather than like this. And the abundance that we had previously where management teams, CEOs, and their corporate entities rode curves that were automatically coming up because of consumption were easier to manage. So my bottom line lesson learned then is, what are we doing to upskill our leadership teams about what is needed going forward, not necessarily what we had looking backwards. And if we're not upskilling our leaders, just like we're trying to upskill our people, we focus on digital upskilling with our people. How to lead through this transition is one of the biggest lessons learned. I think is going to be so important because the premium of market cap and sustainability and the ability to manage that reinvention over the next decade is going to be so important. And those that have the right leaders with the right mindset and the right skills are the ones that are most likely to actually be successful in it.
Thank you, Bob. That was a really rich discussion. And thank you to all of you, really, for joining us today. And thank you for your patience online. It's been great having you with us. We do hope to see you again next year. If you'd like to download the report for yourself and dive into all the details, well, there it is up for you, www.ceosurvey.pwc, www.ceosurvey.pwc. Well, from all of us here, me, Nisha Pillay, Bob Moritz, and the entire team, thank you for joining us, and goodbye.